Yesterday evening whether I had a plan B for today if anything went wrong, and I said no, everything's going to be fine, there's no plan B. I now wish I had a plan B, mainly because our opening keynote speaker has had difficulties. In fact, he's had some papers and luggage stolen from on the train, and so he's currently reporting to the... No, he's not reporting to the police. He's actually speaking to the police just to, with regard to that. So, unfortunately, he's not going to be here he's going to be here to speak to us this morning, but won't be able to speak as the keynote opening speaker. And so we have changed the program rapidly. And Stephen Haddrill, who was going to give a keynote speech later this morning, has kindly said that he will step in and give the opening speech. And then we will adjust the program accordingly during the course of the morning. And we are hoping the Voter Boss will be here as the second speaker, and then we'll have the panel. And so I do apologize for that, for not having a plan B. But what I would like to do now is introduce Stephen Haddrill. You all actually have in your material the profiles of all our speakers, and therefore I don't propose to waste time at this juncture in going through the detail of Stephen, other than to say that Stephen is the Chief Executive Officer of the UK's Financial Reporting Council, and so is the regulator within the UK. So I will ask Stephen to come up and give his keynote speech. Thank you.
Well, here I am, Plan B. Thank you, Philip, for that introduction. Philip's made a strong contribution to our work, not least at a seminar we had in the European Parliament yesterday, where I thought he put some of the issues before us and Sharon Bowles and a number of other opinion formers in this area with great panache and forcefulness. I was a bit worried, actually, about speaking after the panel, because the problem about speaking after a panel is that the panel has said everything that can possibly be said on the matter, and I was a bit perturbed about that. So actually, Plan B has some upside. It has the downside that I haven't actually finally polished this speech, so you'll see that going on as I carry on. It is, frankly, a privilege to be able to speak to such a distinguished audience. And such an international audience. In our view at the FRC, audit is essential to investors. Sometimes it's questioned. Sometimes the more radical policy thinkers suggest that we can do without it. I do not believe that at all. It is essential to investors, and of course we are all relying, particularly at the moment, on investors. We are in fact at a critical moment in the development and regulation of equity markets. And we have to take extreme care, I believe, not to destroy what we have created in our efforts to correct the mistakes we have made. This is of exceptional importance in Europe, with its need for risk capital to finance recovery. And perhaps, therefore, you will allow me a few minutes of explaining our perspective on the issues facing the capital markets, and then I'll move on to a discussion of the audit market. But since we all arrange our regulatory architecture slightly differently, perhaps I should start by explaining what it is the FRC does. We regulate a range of activities critical to the effective functioning of the capital markets in general and equity markets in particular. We set the codes of conduct for corporate governance and investor stewardship. We monitor how companies report and review 300 sets of accounts a year. We approve national accounting standards and audit practices. We approve actuarial standards. And we review the performance of audit firms and issue public reports on the largest ones. We are the disciplinary body for accountants, actuaries, and audits, and our objective is to improve the quality of corporate governance and corporate reporting in order to foster investment, particularly through the equity markets. Now, we do this in a variety of different ways, but much of what we're looking for is behavioral. The application of good judgment in accounting and audit, courageous and well-informed challenge in corporate governance, openness and integrity in reporting, and good, committed, engaged stewardship by institutional shareholders. This focus on behavioral affects the choice of tools to be used in each aspect of our work. For what we're trying to create is at heart a trust system. To provide risk capital, investors must have a level of trust in how that money will be used, accounted for, and returned. When equity markets are working well, there are wonderful means of driving growth and dispersing the rewards of that growth. They provide investors with the incentive to discover the companies with the greatest growth potential, thus helping to solve the economic problem of optimizing resource allocation. And they enable investors to share in that growth, thus distributing its benefits outside the company concerned. And of course, much of that distribution is, and perhaps this is not probably sufficiently understood, is to people with pension funds, is to people saving for the future. It's not just for the rich in our society. I believe, therefore, that the role of equity markets is hugely important and in policy terms neglected at our peril. Finance ministers typically concentrate on debt markets, and perhaps over the experience of recent weeks you can rather see why, but even in better fiscal circumstances, it is the nature of finance ministers to think debt. Governments, after all, issue debt, not equity. And yet the role of equity markets has not been historically important. It has not only been historically important. In the past few years, they provided their vitality yet again. In the London stock market, we have seen something like over £160 billion raised to refinance business in the UK at the point at which the doors of the banks were shut. And confidence was clearly required in order to do that. There have been criticisms that the equity markets drive short-term behaviour, and sometimes that is undoubtedly true. But it is also true that the stock market stepped up to the plate when necessary and took a longer-term perspective of the future. So what can we do to foster trust and confidence in those markets? Well, audit, I believe, has a major role in that. And let me just turn a bit to the future of the audit market and the future of your work. In addressing this subject with a European audience, it is impossible to ignore the big economic challenges facing the Eurozone. Indeed, perhaps the whole European economy at the present time. The consequences of the decisions being taken by our leaders in relation to the Greek debt crisis are far-reaching for the whole of Europe and are a reminder that we're still facing severe aftershocks following the financial crisis. Now, the questions that we're all asking today about how audit can add more value were given birth by the financial crisis. But the problems that we see and the potential that we see in the audit market are not ones that exclusively arise from that financial crisis. In the UK, which I have most experience of, the same questions are coming up again in relation to those companies that are struggling following the financial cutbacks in public expenditure. Some companies that have gone into administration as a result of perhaps of not anticipating those cutbacks, despite the fact that they were debated strongly for a year before the last election a year ago. So this question about how can we make sure that investors are given a good view of risk and that risk is being adequately addressed within the business is central to our consideration of the role of audit, whether we're talking about the financial sector or the non-financial sector. Well, let me make clear that we expect companies to fail. That is part of capitalism, after all. But the public is concerned when companies should have done better at foreseeing risk and doing something about it. In a world that every day looks forward to the future, investors and politicians ask, What is the point of providing assurance that only looks back? And I think that's the challenge that we have to answer. Yes, of course, people want audit to test the assessments of management about the past. Yes, they want assurance that the accounts are in good order. But also, yes, they want some assurance that the company is a going concern for the future, and they're not impressed if a bank or any other company fails a few weeks after being given that clean bill of health. That will not do in the court of public opinion. However, we have to be realistic. Looking forward is a hard and risky thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do, so how do we go about it? First, let me stress that I do not believe it is for auditors to do the job of the management of the business. So rather than talk wholly about the role of auditors, let me spend a few minutes on the role of the board and the role of the management. Their responsibility as corporate managers is to provide a good quality report to the shareholders. And of course, many do, but some don't. In particular, we find in our reviews of companies' annual reports that the reporting of risk and the management of risk is rather a patchy art. We want, in annual reports, the principal risks to be clear, and we want the risks to be as specific as possible to the business. We believe that the board should take full ownership of the whole report and ensure that, as a whole, the whole report gives a fair and balanced view. And we do not see that consistently at the moment. Within the annual report, we believe that there should be a separate report by the Audit Committee, which describes how it's approached its tasks and, crucially, how it has assessed risk. We then propose that the auditor is required to ensure investors that the Audit Committee report represents, again, a fair and balanced view of the work it's done, and that the assessment of risk has been thorough and comprehensive. We believe that such an approach would give investors a better view of what really keeps the directors awake at night, would continue to keep the prime reporting responsibility on the management, not on the auditor, and not expect the auditor to stray beyond their reasonable territory, and crucially would promote the right behaviour in the business. I said a few minutes ago that we were most concerned, as a regulator, in stimulating and promoting the right kind of behaviour in the companies that we're concerned about. So let me expand a bit on that. Reporting is clearly about transparency and providing information, but it is also about enhancing behaviour. The knowledge that a report has to be written promotes good work on which to report. That is why we worry about poor risk reporting that we have seen. We worry that the information, it's not just that the information in the report is of poor quality, we worry even more that the risk assessment and risk mitigation work that has gone on before the report has been poor too. So we recommend that the board signs off that the whole report is balanced and fair to make sure that the board is actually engaged on the full report, that the board itself makes sure that it is a proper description of the business. And we recommend a fuller Audit Committee report, especially on risk, to ensure that the Audit Committee is fully on top of risk management. And we look for that fuller audit report on the work of the Audit Committee to push the auditor to challenge more rigorously, because they themselves have a stronger requirement on which to report. Thus, through reporting, and particularly risk reporting, we aim to give investors a better view of the challenges and opportunities facing the business, and through the assurance of this, provide a fuller role for the audit in future. These are the proposals that we have tabled and have been consulting on over the last few months, and we believe that in the next 2 to 3 weeks we should be able to publish our conclusions in the light of that consultation, and I'm very grateful to those both in the UK and across Europe who have responded so fully to our consultation. Let me turn a bit more then to the role of audit in the future and consider a bit about what we need to debate. But first, let me make a point about making sure that that debate is not hijacked by arguments about issues which, frankly, we probably all agree are not going to be capable of being pursued, but seem to be generating rather more heat in discussion than their place merits. I've particularly mentioned the debate that's going on mandatory joint audits. I've heard very few people who agree that that is a way forward, but it has become almost an iconic subject of debate across Europe. And it seems to me that if we continue to focus on some rather relatively difficult issues like that, we're going to miss a great opportunity, an opportunity to discuss the future of audit and to make some change that will establish audit in a much stronger position for that future. So I applaud the vision of the European Commission in putting the future of audit on the European agenda, but I do encourage the Commission and all of us to focus on what matters, what is really worth doing, on strategic change and making a difference to the capital markets. However, let me spend a few minutes on this question of competition. We in the UK would like to see more competition in the audit market, and that's not because we have concerns about the price of an audit. It is about competition driving up innovation and driving quality. It's also about reducing the risks associated with the loss of one of the big firms. I should say I don't know anything that you don't know about that, just to be absolutely clear. We would particularly like to see more competition in those sectors and those markets where only one or two big firms operate at present. In the UK, therefore, we welcome the study now being conducted by the Office of Fair Trading on competition in the audit market. The competition authorities have the right expertise to look into this matter, and they have a wider range of tools to address any problems that they find that are not available to audit regulators. So I hope that their peers across Europe will also contribute to that debate and not just leave the matter to the consideration of audit regulation. Audit regulation is a fine thing, but it cannot, believe it or not, do everything. And addressing competition problems through audit regulation is not always the best way of tackling the issue. That doesn't mean that we have nothing to contribute. In the UK, we do support a mandatory requirement for the audit to be retendered, perhaps every 8 to 10 years, or for a full explanation to be given to investors about why that is not appropriate. We think some kind of comply or explain caveat around mandatory retendering is appropriate because there may be particular years when it frankly would not make sense to try and change the auditor, either because the company is in difficulties or because it's facing extreme economic circumstances. Such explanations should not, however, be given every year so that we see auditors continue in the same role for decade after decade. And at some point, perhaps at a maximum of 15 to 20 years, the retender should actually be required. Few contracts anywhere in the world are held for anything like a decade, let alone 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And given that these contracts rest on a statutory provision made in the public interest, we believe there should be more challenge to the incumbent than we currently see. We also support the Commission's proposals for effective contingency planning in the event of a major firm leaving the market. The idea of living wills has merit, although they would probably differ considerably from the living wills that we see in the banking market, where capital is the issue, not how to hold on to clients and to management. A failure of a global network would probably require a failure in New York or in London because of the scale of the capital markets there. So we hope that the Commission, in considering these issues of contingency planning, will engage with the US and the UK authorities in some depth on this matter. Finally, let me say something about the organisation of regulation across Europe and internationally. Each of Europe's regulators, and I certainly include the FRC in this, needs to learn continuously from the others. We need to work together and coordinate our actions across borders. And that is why we do support the idea of giving authority to ESMA to ensure that this happens, providing that the work conducted in ESMA is done by audit regulators, not just by securities regulators who do not necessarily have audit expertise. So there we are. You've heard it here. The UK does support a degree of European integration on this matter, and we do support a new European authority, not the creation of additional authority. We don't think that we need a fourth such authority, but we do think that a new role should be given to ESMA to take this forward. I would just make two caveats in making that point. There we are. You didn't think I was actually going to go for it wholesale, did you? First of all, Europe must not ignore the global nature of the audit market. And it's just important for us to collaborate internationally as it is for us to collaborate across Europe. I therefore particularly applaud FEE's initiative today in inviting Jim Doty of the PCAOB to speak this afternoon, and Jim's willingness to reach out to us and come here and address us. Secondly, we must know when not to regulate, as well as when to regulate. We have internationally set new standards for audit and for accounting. We hope the EU will find a way soon to enable their formal adoption. We believe at the FRC that standards are instrumental in raising quality. But we also recognize that, of course, they do what it says on the tin. They standardize. We must not pursue standardization so far that we end up with nothing but box ticking. Crucially, we must not lose the magic qualities of professionalism and skepticism that we all understand, but are so hard to write down, and particularly so hard to capture in a standard. So we see standards as the bedrock of audit, but for audit to achieve its full potential, it needs to bring in other qualities too. It may, of course, if you're sitting in a firm, feel safest to rest on the standards. Doing that, after all, does seem to be felt to reduce liability. But in the court of public opinion, more is required, and the profession needs to pay attention to that if it's really to secure its reputation for the future. Europe is facing many tests in the coming months. The most immediate challenges for policymakers, such as the Greek debt crisis, achieving sustainable economic growth, and making globalization work for the citizens of Europe, will require strong capital markets. But those strong capital markets will depend upon trust. Audit policy cannot therefore be divorced from the economic reality faced by business, regulators, and governments across the world. The auditor's ability to spot risk and alert both regulators and investors is a key role for auditors who have, particularly in the large firms, a good helicopter view across the economy. The test of auditing and accounting is that it makes a strong contribution to these challenges, and I believe that it can and will do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just wanted to save you the embarrassment of not having a question to answer. I was just wondering, whether, because of your strong emphasis of how auditing is part of a capital market system and a governance system, you perhaps feel that the nature of the vision you've articulated is one which is hard to share internationally, because we have, perhaps at a global level, bodies which tend to be focused on audit in isolation, whereas you make a very strong case for audit being part of a wider system. Is that something where there are new forums that might be generated to think of auditing as part of a wider system?
Well, I think that there's obviously, I agree with you, that there's a different emphasis in different parts of the world and in different countries. I mean, in some places, audit is seen perhaps more crucially in the public space as being there to support the work of the public authorities, the work of the tax authorities, and so on. So I do understand that. But I tended to focus on equity because, it seems to me that equity is, one of the big issues for the London capital markets. But audit is also fundamentally important to the debt markets, and they exist throughout the world. I think it's important that we really do establish this link between what audit does and the interests of the investor. And frequently, both as audit regulators and as and sometimes as auditors as well, I think, and as professional bodies, we rather lament the lack of depth of interest of the investment community in audit and the future of audit. So I don't know exactly what new forum we should have, but a forum that really engages investors seems to me to be, and not just a few, but a wide cross-section of investors seems to me to be something that we do need for the future. And I say that because if one can kind of penetrate deep into the investor mindset, I think you start to get answers to some questions about why they don't always seem to show much interest in our work and your work. I was talking recently to a group in the UK who, and my challenge was, take more interest in the appointment of the auditor. It's of fundamental significance, and please do that. And why don't you? And they said, well, the vote comes too late. By the time that we get to vote on the appointment of the auditor, the company has spent months looking into the matter and has come forward with a recommendation. So why don't we have a debate a year before about whether there should be a retender? Why don't we have a vote on that? Why don't we hear from the company a bit more about what they're looking for from the audit and have some engagement around that? And I thought that was quite a good and interesting point. So if we can really get beneath the skin of what investors are looking for, how we can engage them, and that has to be to some extent on their terms, I think, then I think a forum would around those issues. And I know there have been such discussions, but more of that seems to me part of the way forward.
Jens Roeder, please.
Hello, my name is Jens Roeder from the Nordic Federation of Accountants. You mentioned a couple of times financial institutions and banks and the need for auditors to report more on what is written about risk, effectively, by management. Do you foresee or anticipate or think that there might be a divergence in the reporting requirements for those auditors who audit banks and financial institutions as opposed to other listed companies?
I certainly think that auditing a bank is, is a step change in terms of the difficulty that it brings, particularly for the large and systemic institutions. And there are a number of things that we're looking for from auditors in those areas which we don't generally look for. For example, we look for a constructive relationship between the auditor and the regulator. Now, that's not easy to arrange because there are all sorts of confidentiality reasons. To some extent, for those reasons, in the UK, we went through a period of about a decade where that kind of engagement was allowed to lapse, and we suffered as a result of that. So we are now re-energizing that, and I think that's beneficial to both sides. the work of our audit inspectors focuses increasingly on areas of systemic risk, and we therefore do pay very considerable attention to the quality of auditing in that area. The auditors are there for the investors, not for the regulators, but I think that one of the lessons of the crisis is that we have to deepen that relationship in that area. We can all see that the challenges of fair value mark to market have been, really quite significant, both for preparers and for auditors. Getting right answers around what's the right valuation and so on is not easy, but I think the challenge that is coming back is that we want to see some real consistency. And one of the strengths of the large firms in auditing financial services is that they do have a view across a number of financial institutions, across a number of across the way in which preparers are treating more or less the same instruments in different markets and in different companies. And I think, making sure that that learning is spread across the firm and that we get as much appropriate consistency as possible in that audit work is something that we would like a little bit more attention to be paid.
Anthony at the back, and then one.
Thank you. Anthony Carey from Mazar and Aegean, representing the non-Big Four networks. Thank you for the interesting presentation, Stephen. Just one question around, at the beginning you ruled out joint or shared audit. I was just trying to understand, in terms of your policy objectives and the concern that you outlined of the risk of one of the largest firms leading the market, which none of us would want to see, but we have seen already happening a few years ago. To what extent the policy objectives you outline would achieve the addressing the systemic risk issue without joint or shared audit? Because if one's trying to address the systemic risk issue, and for example, in the FTSE 100, I think 52% thereabouts of the audit fees are in the top 20 companies. So there's real systemic concentration at the top end. How can you achieve that without looking at joint or shared audit or some other means to get additional players in the market?
Our principal objective as an audit regulator is in the quality of audit. That's what drives us. We are, as I said, we are concerned to promote competition, but as I also said, we want not competition for its own sake. We want competition that will bring some innovation and bring quality. And our judgment, you probably feel that we're wrong on this, that our judgment brings more risk to quality, that joint auditing brings more risk to quality than it brings benefit in terms of competition. We think that we have some experience to justify that, both in terms of the difficulty of shared responsibility. Divided responsibility is something that we worry about quite significantly. We also worry about cost. I'm also not hearing, in fact, what I am hearing is investors and preparers, and indeed most regulators around Europe, saying that for the reasons I've just given, they don't see this as part of the future. Can I distinguish, though, between joint auditing and the involvement of firms other than the Big Four in the work around assurance and risk and so on in financial institutions? We have proposed in the UK, we proposed to the House of Lords Select Committee that looked at this, that there could well be a role in relation to the advice being given to risk committees for firms other than the auditor, and that would be a seed from which some firms could perhaps grow to be providing audit services in the future. So I think possibly the short answer to your question is that competition is not our objective on its own. It is as a means to quality, and we feel that joint auditing could put that at risk.
Ian Welsh of ACCA. Stephen, a couple of times you mentioned the phrase the court of public opinion. Given that the expectations gap's been with us for about 30 years, and even the educated public assume that once a firm's gone in and signed it off, everything's fine, and it's effectively a 100% guarantee of that, and everyone in this room knows that's not the case. I just wondered how far, realistically, the audit profession can go to meet this court of public opinion.
Well, realistically, there are clearly limits. I mean, as we say in the UK, the man on Clapham Omnibus is not going to be focusing particularly on this above who's going to be managing Chelsea next season. So, you know, I can see the limitation. I think it's a mindset for the profession and for us that matters. If our mindset is, hey, you know, we're the experts, we talk to each other, we decide these things, we know what's possible and what's not possible, then, you know, we're kind of going to get it stuck in a downward spiral. And I would include the regulators in that. If the mindset is, you know, what are the politicians really getting at here? They may have completely got it wrong, but, you know, what's that kind of seed that's driving them to have this anxiety about our role and about how well we're doing it? And, you know, let's really try and think about how we can see our work through their eyes. And I'm talking about the informed public or the you know, opinion formers. And try and, as far as we can, adjust what we do to meet that expectation. Then I think, you know, that's as in any business, that's a sign of health. It's not, you know, any business that gets into a mindset that, you know, we know best, we're going to be defensive about that, is a business that's riding for a fall. And that, you know, we know what the public thinks, we know what the expectation gap is. I don't think it's up to I don't think that means the public may not be right, but they're not going to change. We're the ones who have to think, what lessons do we learn from that, and how do we adapt? And I think, you know, this is exactly why it's right that Philip has set this debate up this morning, because I think that's what we're trying to address.
David. David Saffron.
Yes. Thank you. David Saffron from the Belgian Institute of Registered Auditors. 5 years ago, we introduced a cap on liability in Belgium, and this was introduced by law. One of the motivation was to increase competition. Introducing a cap on liability was also targeted in encouraging small and medium-sized practitioners to enter the audit market of listed company, credit institutions, and insurance companies. Shouldn't we encourage this at European level, as it was recommended in a European recommendation a few years ago?
In the UK, we have this concept of proportionate liability. Personally, I prefer that than an absolute cap. It seems to me that it's fair to expect the auditor to pay their share of any significant mistake, but not. And I think that the concept of proportionality is a better concept than the concept of a cap. It doesn't work in the UK particularly, and that's because it has to be negotiated with the company, and no company is going to agree to it. Why should they? So there is a question for us about whether it should be given a legal basis. Our political masters have decided not to pursue that at the moment. But I think the question of liability has to be part of the debate that we're having today. We are, in looking for more from audit, we are looking for audit to get out of a box of just focusing on what has happened in the year behind us, and think a little bit more and say a bit more about about what the management is saying about risk in the future. And I recognise that that puts the auditors in a difficult position. I also recognise that you know, within audit firms, those people who do want to do things differently are often held back by the legal advice that they get and so on, and that's obviously driven by concerns about liabilities. So, you know, from our point of view, if we all want more from audit, and I think we do, then we have to accept that perhaps we have to start at least reopen the debate about the question of liability. I don't know what the right answer is, but as far as I'm concerned, it should be on the table.
I'm going to have to bring this part of the debate to a close, but I would like just to, Stephen invited me to ask a question when nobody was going to ask any questions, but I do have a question, and I'd just like to go, because Stephen, you've touched on the auditor, you've touched on the regulator, but in your speech, you did touch on the role of the board and of the management. And I get the sense that the audit profession is prepared to move forward, is prepared to be more forward-looking. But I also get the sense that boards and management aren't necessarily in that same place at the moment and are reluctant. Views, please?
I think we have some beacons, and we have a lot of dark territory as well. I mean, again, you know, you can see why what the motivation is for not changing, and that's why I think it's so important that we really do engage the investor community, because it seems to me that, you know, the investor community is either a force for change, or it's a force for just leaving things as they are by you know, lack of attention and so on. So, I mean, I accept your point. I think we have to get a different debate going with investors to address that.
So I would like to draw this to a close. I would like to thank Stephen for his contribution. You are going to be part of the...
I get lots of questions.
Well, no, well, it's up to you whether you want to join the panel later. But so I wish you would join me in showing your appreciation.